Well, tonight, 1 Samuel. Last week we finished off going through Ruth. It was the shortest book that we had encountered in our Bible survey series. And we got to see the sweetness of that small story. A small story of God's loyal love against the background of the time of the Judges, where everybody was doing what was right in their own eyes. There was no king in Israel, and everyone was doing what was right in their own eyes. And yet, in the midst of that, in Bethlehem, there's a story of this little family that God is choosing to put his character on display through. And then we saw something big at the end of Ruth. And if you want to look there with me, that last little part of Ruth sets us up well for the book of 1 Samuel here tonight. Those last few verses there are a genealogy at the end of Ruth. These are the generations of Perez. Perez fathered Hezron. Hezron fathered Ram. Ram fathered Amminadab. Amminadab fathered Nahshon. Nahshon fathered Salmon. Salmon fathered Boaz. Boaz fathered Obed. Obed fathered Jesse, and Jesse fathered David. Now, when we get into 1 Samuel, this is when David comes on the scene. This major character in Old Testament history. And the importance of David is not just for Old Testament, but for New Testament as well, as we'll see later on in our study. But so, we come now to this book titled 1 Samuel, and really, 1 Samuel and 2 Samuel are just one big story, but we're just going to deal with 1 Samuel here tonight. And if you want to look at your sheet there, your information sheet, under historical context, let's kind of get the lay of the land. Where are we in the history of Israel at this point in time? The book of 1 Samuel describes the transition in Israel from the time of the Judges to the establishment of their monarchy in Israel. The narrative begins with the birth of Samuel. Now, Samuel is considered to be the last of the judges and the first of the great prophets in Israel. And a big part of this book is the fact that the people refuse to heed the warning of God given through Samuel, and they cry out for a human king. Because you remember, the people of Israel are a theocracy, God as king. But they reject God as king because they want to be like all the other nations that surround them. Their trust in a monarchy is a rejection of God as their king. And that leads God to give them their first king. And their first king, his name is Saul. And Saul, he looks the part. In the text, he's called handsome. He's tall, right? And he starts off being very militaristic and delivering the people. And so, from a worldly perspective, he really gets the job done. But he has a refusal to obey Yahweh. And that leads to God telling Samuel to anoint David as the future king of Israel. So in great contrast to Saul, we now have David who is a man after God's own heart, a king who in many ways foreshadows Jesus Christ, who will sit on the throne of David eternally. Even David, though, in his sin and his shortcomings, reveals that he cannot be what Israel ultimately needs. Even David can't be that for them. And then 1 Samuel casts our eyes still beyond its pages to the Messiah himself. That sets us up to get the lay of the land here. And so the book really centers on these three main human characters. Okay? Yahweh, who is always the hero. Okay? We need to remember that. Whatever book we're in, Yahweh's the hero. And so we'll see that Yahweh is the hero, that he's going to highlight his character, highlight his work through these three men. We see Samuel really being the focus of chapters 1 through 7. Then Saul, the first king of the monarchy, in chapters 8 through 15. And Saul and David together there in chapters 16 through 31. And that brings us to the end of that book. So that's just a good way to break down the structure if you're thinking about how to walk through this. So as we're walking through these themes, we're going to bounce around this book quite a bit. And so get your fingers ready. But I want us to think about the backdrop of Israel's rejection of God as king. Think about that. That's going to be the negative, stark backdrop. The fact that they looked at God and said, no, not you. We don't want you as king. We'll trust in a monarchy instead. That's going to be the backdrop. But then against that backdrop, what does this book say about who God is? What does this book say about how we should relate to God? And what does this book say about what we really need? Okay? With that in mind, let's turn to 5 different themes that are going to help us understand this book so that we can walk through it with greater depth. Okay. Vindicated glory. Vindicated glory. Let's look at chapter 4. Chapter 4. Saul's not on the stage yet. David's not on the stage yet. But Samuel is. And something happens in chapter 4 that is of great significance. The ark is captured by the Philistines. The ark is captured by the Philistines, and that's a big deal because it signifies the presence of God among his people. And it's interesting, the people of Israel think that somehow that the Ark of the Covenant is going to be for them almost like a lucky charm. Dale Ralph Davis in his commentary on 1 Samuel says that. He says they're kind of using it like a rabbit's foot. Let's bring this into battle, and then we'll be able to defeat the Philistines, Well, the Ark is taken by the Philistines. The presumption of the people of Israel fails them. And with the Philistines, then having the ark, we see something about God that should make our hearts realize afresh that we can trust him. And that this is the God that we want to look to. This is the God that we want to trust. This is our mighty, holy, sovereign God. None compares with him. So the Philistines take the ark themselves. They take it back to their own land. And look with me at chapter 5. What happens when the Philistines have this ark? Again, representing the presence of God among the people, right? Look with me starting in verse 1. When the Philistines captured the ark of God, they brought it from Ebenezer to Ashdod. Then the Philistines took the ark of God and brought it into the house of Dagon and set it up beside Dagon. That's their God, right? That's their false God. And when the people of Ashdod rose early the next day, behold, Dagon had fallen face downward on the ground before the ark of the Lord. So they took Dagon and put him back in his place. But when they rose early on the next morning, behold, Dagon had fallen face downward on the ground before the ark of the Lord, and the head of Dagon and both his hands were lying cut off on the threshold. Only the trunk of Dagon was left to him. Now, this is hilarious, actually. Because, first of all, if you look at me at verse 3, Dagon has fallen down, right? The ark's right there, signifying the presence of God, Yahweh, and the statue of Dagon is on the ground, face down, and what do? They have to pick it up. The ones that are worshiping the statue have to pick him up and put him back in his place, which is ironic. Makes me think of that passage in Isaiah. You take a piece of wood and you make your idol, right? And you bow down to it even though you are the one who made it. It's foolish. And then, the next day, Dagon has fallen face downward again, but his head and his hands have been severed. They're lying cut off in order to portray him as powerless. powerless before Yahweh. And so there's no contest. I wrote that there in your notes there. In chapters 4 and 5, vindicated glory. So the Philistines think, oh, we've done it. We've taken the Ark of the Covenant. They think that they have mastered the God of the Israelites. But they take it back and they find out very quickly that is not the case at all. And that actually isn't the end of the story. Because if you look at verse 6, we read this. The hand of the Lord was heavy against the people of Ashdod. And he terrified and afflicted them with tumors, both Ashdod and its territory. And when the men of Ashdod saw how things were, they said, the ark of the God of Israel must not remain with us, for his hand is hard against us and against Dagon, our God. They get it. They won't submit, but they get it, at least on some level. So they sent and gathered out together all the lords of the Philistines and said, what shall we do with the ark of God? And they answered, let the ark of the God of Israel be brought around to Gath. Okay, so they're like, okay, let's just move locations. Let's just take it from Ashdod. Let's take it over to Gath now, see if that helps, right? So they brought the ark of the God of Israel there, but after they had brought it around, the hand of the Lord was against that city, causing a very great panic, and he afflicted the men of the city, both young and old, so that tumors broke out on them. Same thing happens. So they sent the ark of God to Ekron. But as soon as the ark of God came to Ekron, the people of Ekron cried out, they have brought around to us the ark of God to kill us and our people. They sent therefore and gathered together all the lords of the Philistines and said, send away the ark of the God of Israel and let it return to its own place, that it may not kill us and our people. For there was a deathly panic throughout the whole city. The hand of God was very heavy there. Now, if you're reading through that on your own, and you're doing your own personal study, or you have 1 Samuel as your devotional material in the mornings, you should be underlining the hand of the Lord is heavy against them. The hand of the Lord is heavy against them. The hand of the Lord is heavy against them. They have not overcome Yahweh, not in the least. But notice this. The people of Philistia have to take Dagon and put him back in his place. Yahweh doesn't require anything like that. He's going to afflict them with these tumors. He's going to cause them to experience great affliction and distress. But there's no one doing it for him because he's completely self-sustaining, independent. He is the I am. He needs no one or nothing. So it might seem like, oh, look, they've overcome Yahweh. Look, they took the Ark of the Covenant. They've taken it back to their land. What a shame. Our God couldn't do what we needed him to do for us. But God says, oh no, my glory will be vindicated. I will be vindicated. And he shows that there. See, the people of Israel have, we'll see later, they reject Yahweh. But there's no good reason to do so. Absolutely no good reason to do so because of who he is and who he demonstrates himself to be. Okay, now let's actually go to look at that passage in chapter 8. Okay, God's vindicated glory. His glory will be upheld. That's what I want you to see here. He's going to be the one that shows himself to be mighty, shows himself to be awesome. We see that time and time again. Chapter 8, verse 7. And the Lord said to Samuel, because Samuel's, like I said, one of the first of the great prophets. So he's speaking through Samuel to the people. But he says to Samuel, obey the voice of the people in all they say to you, for they have not rejected you, but they have rejected me from being king over them, according to all the deeds that they have done from the day I brought them up out of Egypt, even to this day, forsaking me and serving other gods. So they are also doing to you. They've rejected me. They're doing what they've done before. They were serving other gods. They're doing this again. They're rejecting me once more, he says. Look with me at verses 19 and 20. See, in the previous section there, in verses 10 through 18, Samuel's going to warn them about the trouble of having a king of your own, a human king of your own. And this is what we read the people did. But the people refused to obey the voice of Samuel, and they said, no, but there shall be a king over us, that we may also be like all the nations. and that our king may judge us and go out before us and fight our battles. And when Samuel had heard all the words of the people, he repeated them in the ears of the Lord. And the Lord said to Samuel, obey their voice and make them a king. And Samuel then said to the men of Israel, go every man to his city. So we see here that Israel has rejected God. And what he does is he gives them their first king. But their first king is trouble, right? It's okay, he does well for a while, but then he ends up showing himself to be this faithless man who is just thirsty for his own glory, who relies upon himself instead of on Yahweh. In chapter 13, this first king, Saul, first we see in chapter 13, verse 14, that he does something that is considered to be heinous in the eyes of God. I'll start in verse 13, actually, of chapter 13. And Samuel said to Saul, you have done foolishly. You have not kept the command of the Lord your God with which he commanded you, for then the Lord would have established your kingdom over Israel forever. But now your kingdom shall not continue. The Lord has sought out a man after his own heart, and the Lord has commanded him to be prince over his people because you have not kept what the Lord commanded you. So let this unauthorized sacrifice that he had made before Samuel got there, he makes this sacrifice himself, which is a big no-no. He does it himself, and now he says, the kingdom's taken away from you. There's going to be another that's going to take your place. He's told that. And then chapter 15, if you recall, the Lord commands them to wipe out the Amalekites, all of them, and their livestock. But you know what Saul does? He interprets that command himself. He takes God's word and God's command, and he says, I'll do what I want with it. And so what happens is they actually keep some of the prime livestock, for sacrifices, and then they let the king, Agag, they let him live. Even though God said, wipe all of them out. So he refuses to obey, and we read this in verse 26 of chapter 15. Samuel said to Saul, I will not return with you, for you have rejected the word of the Lord, and the Lord has rejected you from being king over Israel. Now this is, I think, a kind of irony. The people in chapter 8 had rejected God. Right? And he says, okay, you can have your king. Here's who he is, this faithless, self-reliant king. He's not a man after my own heart. And so God takes their king and he says, I've rejected you. He rejects the king that they wanted so badly. Do you see that God's going to vindicate his glory? He's going to uphold his glory. He's not this weak little God that says, oh, you reject me? Okay, I'll just do whatever you want to, and backs into a corner. He's not that kind of God. He is all-powerful. He will be upheld. He will be magnified. And we see that time and time again. Israel rejects God. God rejects Saul. Now, we'll turn to the most well-known, probably, passage in 1 Samuel, which is David and Goliath in chapter 17. Now, you may have heard sermons about David and Goliath that are way off base, okay? Like, you take the 5 stones of prayer and Bible study and self-esteem, and you take those and you put those in your pouch, and you defeat whatever cross you have to bear in life. And whatever your trial is, that's what you need to face, and that's your giant, and so trust the Lord and you can defeat that. There are people that preach that way. I know that's kind of like a caricature, but there are people that preach that way. And we shouldn't even say, okay, well, this is an allegory. Like, David is Jesus, and Goliath is Satan. And he's going to defeat Satan. He's going to crush the head of the serpent. And you're like, okay, well, I like that because it's got good theology in it, but that's not ultimately what the passage is about. Right? That's not how we should interpret that text. Here's how we should interpret it. It's all about God's glory being upheld. Okay? Let me show you. Chapter 17. Now, I want you to write down in your notes perhaps, or get your pen ready to circle, the word defy. This helps us understand the big picture of 1 Samuel chapter 17, the word defy. And I'm looking at that in the ESV translation. But I want to show you 6 occasions when we see this word in chapter 17. Okay? So, verse 10. The Philistine, that's Goliath, right? He's coming out and he's taunting the armies of God, the people of Israel. He comes out and he says, I defy the ranks of Israel this day. Give me a man that we may fight together. When Saul and all Israel heard these words of the Philistine, they were dismayed and greatly afraid. But he says, I defy the ranks of Israel. Then we come to verse 25. All right, so David shows up. He's there among some of the men of Israel who are quaking in their boots, who are fleeing. They're much afraid. And verse 25, we read this. And the men of Israel said, have you seen this man who has come up? Surely he has come up to defy Israel. And the king will enrich the man who kills him with great riches. Okay? And then verse 26, David says this. He says to the men who stood by him, what shall be done for the man who kills this Philistine and takes away the reproach from Israel? That word reproach it's the same word for defy in the Hebrew. So you can circle that too. And then he says, for who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the armies of the living God? Not just the armies of Israel, notice, but the armies of the living God. That's significant. Let's keep going here. Speaking to Saul, David says this in verse 36, your servant has struck down both lions and bears, and this uncircumcised Philistine shall be like one of them, for he has defied the armies of the living God. Verse 45. Then David said to the Philistine, you come to me with a sword and with a spear and with a javelin, but I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. There it is again. Over and over and over again. That gets at the heart of why David has come up against Goliath in the first place. Because this giant is coming out and he's taunting the people of Israel. He's taunting the armies of Israel, but they're not just the armies of Israel, they're the armies of the God of Israel, Yahweh himself. And so David sees it as a direct reproach against Yahweh. As if Goliath is taking God's glory and dragging it through the mud, or trying to at least. And so what happens with all this? What happens? Well, first of all, we see he's defeated. He's defeated. If you look with me going on in verse 46, this day the Lord will deliver you into my hand. He's saying this to Goliath, right? This 9-foot warrior decked out in all kinds of armor with all kinds of weapons. He's actually said no to any armor himself. They tried to put it on him. He's like, no. He doesn't have a sword. All he's got is a sling and 5 stones. And he only uses 1, by the way, not all 5. And we read this. This day the Lord will deliver you into my hand, and I will strike you down, and I will cut off your head. And I'll give the dead bodies of the host of the Philistines this day to the birds of the air and to the wild beasts of the earth. Why? Why? That all the earth may know that there is a God in Israel. It's not about David. He's saying, I'm going to do this to you so that people will know that God exists, that God is in the midst of the people of Israel. And verse 47, and that all the assembly may know that the Lord saves, not with sword and spear. For the battle is the Lord's, and he will give you into our hand. So he's saying, it's not me, it's not my power. The Lord's going to give you into our hand. It's his doing. The battle belongs to him. And he's going to give this victory to us so that he is seen, his glory is upheld, so that all this reproach that you're giving him will be shown to be completely foolish and heinous, a transgression of the highest order. Because God will be glorified. He will be vindicated. And I remember when the first time I saw this masterful on the part of God in revealing this in verse 50. We read earlier that David runs quickly, verse 48, to the battle, to meet the Philistine. David put his hand in his bag and took out a stone and slung it and struck the Philistine on his forehead. The stone sank into his forehead and he fell on his face to the ground. Verse 50 now. So David prevailed over the Philistine with a sling and with a stone and struck the Philistine and killed him. There was no sword in the hand of David. Why would he say that? Why that little sentence there? There was no sword in the hand of David. Why is that important? Because a sword is seen as the typical weapon that you would use to defeat armies, right? It was a sign of strength. And so if you had your sword, then you had strength with you. You had the appropriate typical weapon that you would use to defeat your enemy. But if you have no sword, then you're weak, aren't you? You have no sword, you're weak. And yet he prevailed over the Philistine with no sword in order to reveal that the battle belongs to Yahweh. The battle belongs to the Lord, so that he will get the glory. He used a weak young man, right? A ruddy youth, he's called in the text, without a sword in his hand. So who gets the glory? Yeah, God does. Not David. He doesn't get the glory. This ruddy youth, he didn't get the glory. It's God who gets the glory because there was no sword, there's no armor, there's no experienced soldier. So God is highlighted. He is lauded. He is set apart, isn't he? As the God that he truly is. So, vindicated glory. Even though he's rejected by the people of Israel, right? That says nothing about who he is. That says nothing about his character. He's going to show himself in this book to be the preeminent God, the only God. Okay? All right. Sovereign protection we see next. And by sovereign protection, what I'm referring to is his sovereign protection over his king. This second king of Israel, David, the man after God's own heart, as he's called. He's going to protect him because God has plans for David. David is going to be this king who starts this kingly line through which Jesus Christ himself will come. And so God is going to make sure that this king is protected. He's looking out for him at every point along the way. Okay, there's much of God's protection to see here. So look with me in your Bibles at chapter 19. Chapter 19. Saul is very jealous of David. Remember, the ladies come dancing and singing back into the city. Saul has killed his thousands. David has killed his 10,000s. Right? And this infuriates Saul. And because of his great anger and jealousy of David, he's going to seek to kill him for a long time. That's a long part of the narrative, is him seeking to put David to death. And so, in chapter 19, verse 11, this is ironic. David, who's married to Saul's daughter Michal, she is the one that God uses to protect his king. Verse 11, Saul sent messengers to David's house to watch him, that he might kill him in the morning. But Michal, David's wife, told him, if you do not escape with your life tonight, tomorrow you will be killed. So Michal let David down through the window, and he fled away and escaped. Saul's own daughter, right, is the one who preserves her husband, which is David, the one that Saul hates and despises. So we see God's protection through Michal. We also see God's protection through the miraculous. So we would say that, as we talked about last week with providence, Michal was meant more of God's protection of David through providence, right? Normal, mundane things in life, not the miraculous that breaks into the normal processes of life in a way that is unexpected, right? So we also see God preserving and protecting through miracles, okay? So if you look with me later on in chapter 19, we will see, starting in verse 18, this miraculous preservation. Now David fled and escaped, and he came to Samuel at Ramah and told him all that Saul had done to him. And he and Samuel went and lived at Naioth. And it was told Saul, behold, David is at Naioth in Ramah. Then Saul sent messengers to take David. And when they saw the company of the prophets prophesying, and Samuel standing as head over them, the Spirit of God came upon the messengers of Saul, and they all prophesied. When it was told Saul, he sent other messengers, and they also prophesied. And Saul sent messengers again a third time, and they also prophesied. Then he himself went to Ramah, and came to the great well that is in Secu, and he asked, "Where are Samuel and David?" And one said, "Behold, they are at Naioth in Ramah." And he went there to Naioth in Ramah, and the Spirit of God came upon him also. And as he went, he prophesied until he came to Naioth in Ramah. And he too stripped off his clothes. And he too prophesied before Samuel, and lay naked all that day and all that night. Thus it is said, "Is Saul also among the prophets?" It's a hilarious thing. Everybody's trying to get to David. All these prophets, all these people are trying to get to David, and they prophesy, and they prophesy, and they prophesy. They can't get to David. They're sent by Saul, but no one is able to actually reach David. Even Saul himself goes, and he's struck, right, in a sense. The Spirit of God comes upon him. He starts prophesying, and really this is an embarrassing, shameful thing that happens to him. He strips off all his clothes. He stays there all day. This is the king, right? This king of Israel that we see here in this text. There's a great contrast between him and David time and time again throughout the book of 1 Samuel, isn't there? But there's this miraculous, God sending the Spirit to come upon all of these different messengers so that David cannot be accessed. Therefore, he can't be taken. Therefore, he can't be killed. This is God's work, isn't it? Miraculous work. But God also protects through Jonathan, who happens to be Saul's son, right? Michal is his daughter. Jonathan is his son. There's this wonderful and beautiful friendship between Jonathan and David. And Jonathan is going to protect his friend at all costs. And so Jonathan and David kind of cook up this little scheme to find out if Saul is actually planning on killing David. And Jonathan discovers that it's true. His dad wants to kill his best friend. And so in verse 30, Saul's anger was kindled against Jonathan. And he said to him, "You son of a perverse, rebellious woman, do I not know that you have chosen the son of Jesse," it's David, "to your own shame and to the shame of your mother's nakedness? For as long as the son of Jesse lives on the earth, neither you nor your kingdom shall be established." Don't you get it, Jonathan? There's consequences for you in this too. "Therefore send and bring him to me, for he shall surely die." Then Jonathan answered Saul his father, "Why should he be put to death? What has he done?" But Saul hurled his spear at him to strike him. Not David this time. This is his own son. So Jonathan knew that his father was determined to put David to death. And so Jonathan works to preserve his dear friend as a result of this. God will even use his own enemies to preserve his king, David. And we see that in chapter 23. I love this little account at the end of chapter 23. Look with me at verse 24. Really, that paragraph that begins halfway through that verse. "Now David and his men were in the wilderness of Maon, in the Arabah to the south of Jeshimon, and Saul and his men went to seek him." Still on David's tail. "And David was told, so he went down to the rock and lived in the wilderness of Maon. And when Saul heard that, he pursued after David in the wilderness of Maon. Saul went on one side of the mountain, and David and his men on the other side of the mountain. And David was hurrying to get away from Saul. As Saul and his men were closing in on David and his men to capture them, a messenger came to Saul saying, 'Hurry and come, for the Philistines have made a raid against the land.' So Saul returned from pursuing after David and went after the Philistines. Therefore, that place was called the Rock of Escape." Isn't that great? He's saying, God says, I'm going to send the Philistines to go make this raid so that whenever Saul has to hear about this, he's going to have to come back and deal with the mess. And therefore, I will have my king preserved once again. He uses his own enemies, the Philistines, the ones who took the ark of God. He's going to preserve David through them even, because God is sovereign over all. Sovereign protection. And though we're not a king of Israel, you and I are not leading Israel. We're not kings at all. You'd say, well, in terms of the world's standards, I'm not important. But God is going to protect his people. Now, by that, I don't mean that God is going to keep you safe always and you're never going to come into any danger whatsoever. I'm not saying that. But I'm saying that when we look at texts like this, we see the protective heart of God. And even if you encounter trouble in this life through persecution, health problems, affliction of all various kinds, because you have a protective God that maybe in this life I'm having to endure a lot of hardship. But even in that, God is using it. He will always take his sovereignty and use it for the good of his people, for their benefit, for their conformity to Christ. And he will forever protect me from hell. He will forever protect me from Satan leading me astray eternally. He will preserve me. We believe in the perseverance of the saints here, right? I like the way R.C. Sproul says it. He says, I like the terminology, the preservation of the saints. Because perseverance, it puts more of the onus on us. Like, I'm going to persevere. Just watch me, right? But preservation is God preserving his people, protecting us eternally, and not letting us go. Nothing in all of creation is able to separate us from the love of God in Christ Jesus our Lord. Romans 8:38 and 39. And so even though you say, well, okay, he's protecting David here circumstantially, my circumstances feel hard. They don't feel like God's protecting me. First of all, you need to step back and say, let's get the big picture. We're wrapped up in Jesus' hand. John chapter 10. And the Father's hand, Jesus says. And no one is able to snatch them out of Jesus' hand or the Father's hand, referring to the sheep, referring to the people of God, those who trust in Jesus. So let's remember that. He protects, and he will do so. He'll keep you safe for eternity, even if life ends up being hard. It's all instrumental, isn't it? Because you could look at David, I think. You could say, well, he's having to flee for his life. Those circumstances don't seem very protective, but they are, just in a different way. And so, what has he preserved us from that we don't even know about? I look at that text and maybe, I wonder, did David know how close they were to him? I don't know. Maybe he didn't. I can't tell from the text. Did he know that they were right on his heels or not? Because they're kind of on the other side of the mountain there, it says. How many times has God preserved us in ways we don't even perceive? He's a protective God. Trust him. What about authentic faith? That's another thing we see in the book of 1 Samuel. And really, we see authentic faith in a contrast between David's faith and then Saul's faithlessness. Okay? That's why you're going to see the right way to relate to God through what you see in David, but then Saul's faithlessness is really a contrast to that. It's like night and day. We're meant to see a difference. David's faith is seen in a few different places. We'll kind of pick up the pace a little bit more now here. 1 Samuel chapter 17, verse 37. He's talking to Saul. By the way, Saul should be the one out there confronting the giant. You ever thought about that? He's the king. Who else should be out there confronting this giant who's defying the God of Israel than the king of Israel? But he's not doing it. He's in his tent. David comes and he says, I'll go out there, this ruddy youth. And in verse 37, we see the faith of David exemplified. He says, the Lord who delivered me from the paw of the lion and from the paw of the bear will deliver me from the hand of this Philistine. He's going to deliver me. He's going to keep me safe. This giant's not taking me down. It reminds me of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, right? Who said, God's going to deliver us from this flame. They were confident. He said, but even if he doesn't, we're not going to bow to you, Nebuchadnezzar. We see that same kind of faith in David here. What about verse 46? We already read this, but just to show you through this lens of faith, look at it again. This day the Lord will deliver you into my hand, and I will strike you down and cut off your head. And I will give the dead bodies of the host of the Philistines this day to the birds of the air and to the wild beasts of the field. Right? And then he goes on to say, it's not because of me, it's because of God delivering you into our hands. So his faith is in Yahweh again. And Saul's still in his tent, quaking in his boots. What about chapter 23? We see his faith exemplified here as well. Verse 1, now they told David, behold, the Philistines are fighting against Keilah and are robbing the threshing floors. Therefore, David inquired of the Lord, shall I go and attack these Philistines? And the Lord said to David, go and attack the Philistines and save Keilah. Verse 4, then David inquired of the Lord again, and the Lord answered him, arise, go down to Keilah, for I will give the Philistines into your hand. And then we see once more in verses 10 and 11, then David said, O Lord, the God of Israel, your servant has surely heard that Saul seeks to come to Keilah to destroy the city on my account. Will the men of Keilah surrender me into his hand? Will Saul come down as your servant has heard? O Lord, the God of Israel, please tell your servant. And the Lord said, he will come down. Again, point after point after point. He's going to inquire of the Lord. He's going to seek the Lord for direction and for guidance. This is faith. Chapter 24. We'll see in chapter 24 and really a couple of times, we'll see the fact that David spares Saul's life, which is an act of great faith. Now you say, okay, why is that an act of great faith? Well, let's look and see. When Saul returned from following the Philistines, he was told, behold, David is in the wilderness of En-Gedi. Then Saul took 3,000 chosen men out of all Israel and went to seek David and his men in front of the wild goats' rocks. And he came to the sheepfolds by the way, where there was a cave, and Saul went in to relieve himself. Now David and his men were sitting in the innermost parts of the cave. And the men of David said to him, here is the day of which the Lord said to you, behold, I will give your enemy into your hand, and you shall do to him as it seems good to you. So what's happening here? David's with his men. They're in the back of the cave. Saul comes in there, and they're like, this is it. God has brought him here for this very moment. It's so perfect. How can this not be God setting you up to take this guy out? But that's not the way that David sees it. David rose and stealthily cut off a corner of Saul's robe. And afterward, David's heart struck him because he had cut off a corner of Saul's robe. He said to his men, the Lord forbid that I should do this thing to my Lord, the Lord's anointed, to put out my hand against him, seeing he is the Lord's anointed. He said, it's not really about Saul as much as the fact that God chose Saul. God chose Saul to be the king over Israel, and because of that, there's this reverent faith that David has. I'm not going to kill him. I will not, because of his faith. And then in the same context there, in verse 12, may the Lord judge between me and you. May the Lord avenge me against you, but my hand shall not be against you. Verse 15, may the Lord therefore be judge and give sentence between me and you, and see to it and plead my cause and deliver me from your hand. But I'm not going to kill you. So it's important that we see that David's trust is in God. It's not in himself, not in his sword, not in his knife, right? It's in God. He's not going to strike the Lord's anointed. In chapter 26, the same thing happens. And I'll just kind of give you an overview here. David spares Saul's life again. He's in the midst of the camp. He's sleeping. David goes in with Ahimelech. And there Saul is sleeping. It's perfect. And he has the opportunity again to just take out Saul, but he doesn't do it. And so we read this. Verse 9, but David said to Abishai, do not destroy him, for who can put out his hand against the Lord's anointed and be guiltless? And David said, as the Lord lives, the Lord will strike him, or his day will come to die, or he will go down into battle and perish. The Lord forbid that I should put out my hand against the Lord's anointed. But take now the spear that is that is at his head and the jar of water, and let's go. So he says, he may die some other way. Maybe he'll die in battle, right? Maybe his day is going to come to die, but it's not going to be at my hand. So he's giving Saul up to God and saying, God's going to choose how he's going to die, but it's not going to be at my hand because I would be guilty if I did this. And he's doing this because of Yahweh again. Just like he went up and he fought against Goliath, but it wasn't about him. It wasn't about showing off. It wasn't about the fact that he's just like, yeah, this thug, I hate the fact that he's so snarky. He's so smug. I just want to take this guy out. He's making me mad. It wasn't about that. It was just because Yahweh, his glory was being dragged through the mud by this guy. And now he's like, it's not really about Saul so much as it's about God who chose him to be the king of Israel. Faith. Chapter 30. Verses 1 through 6. Now when David and his men came to Ziklag on the third day, the Amalekites had made a raid against the Negeb and against Ziklag. They'd overcome Ziklag and burned it with fire, and taken captive the women and all who were in it, both small and great. They killed no one, but carried them off and went their way. And when David and his men came to the city, they found it burned with fire, and their wives and sons and daughters taken captive. Then David and the people who were with him raised their voices and wept until they had no more strength to weep. David's 2 wives also had been taken captive, Ahinoam of Jezreel and Abigail, the widow of Nabal of Carmel. And David was greatly distressed, for the people spoke of stoning him, because all the people were bitter in soul, each for his sons and daughters. But look what he does. But David strengthened himself in the Lord his God. People want him to stone him, you know? I think I'd be like in the corner of some cave, sucking my thumb, right, and shaking violently. But he strengthens himself in the Lord. He returns to God in this desperate time. His wives, they've been taken as well. All of his men's wives, the children. And he strengthens himself in the Lord. What a testimony for us of faith. What do you do when tragedy strikes? This is tragic. Will you reject him? Will you distance yourself from him? Or will you draw near and strengthen yourself in the Lord actively through your prayer and through the scriptures and what they say, grasping the promises of God? So that's David's faith. And you can see there Saul's faithlessness time and time again. I'm just going to give a summary here. Chapter 22, we've already kind of seen chapter 15, but chapter 22, because there is this priest who helps David whenever he was seeking him to kill him. There's this priest that he finds out who was helping David, and this guy named Doeg the Edomite actually rats this priest out. And so what Saul does is he commands that the priest and all the other priests, Ahimelech is his name, and all the other priests be killed. But no one wants to do it, so he says, Doeg, the guy who ratted this other priest out, you do it. Kill the priest and all the rest of them. And he does. He wipes them out. At his own command, he has them slaughtered. This is the faithlessness of Saul. All because this priest helped David to escape. And then, in chapter 28, you may remember this story. The Philistines have approached again. And so in verse 6, Saul inquires of the Lord, but the Lord doesn't answer him, either by dreams or by Urim or by the prophets. God doesn't answer when he inquires. He's seeing the armies of the Philistines approaching, and God doesn't answer him. So what does he do? He doesn't trust the Lord. He doesn't trust that he's just going to wait on the Lord. No, he actually goes to find a medium, right? The medium of Endor. It's a rebellious act. It's a godless act. But he seeks this avenue of revelation instead of trusting the Lord. And then we see at the end of the book of 1 Samuel, the way it ends is that Saul falls on his own sword in his faithlessness, kills himself. That's the contrast to David's faith. You say, okay, well then David, he's the answer. We've spent all that time in the Judges. It was such a dark time. We were walking through the time of the Judges and all of the people that were doing everything they wanted to do, just following their own hearts. That was a horrible It's what the people did in their godlessness and worshiping false gods along the way, and God had to oppress them, and then he sent a judge to rescue them, and that was a dark time. I'm so glad that we're out of that time. So glad that we're out of the time of the judges. Now we've got a king that can really get things done. See, that's all they needed. They just needed a king that was a man after God's own heart. But even David is a fallen hero. He's not perfect. You lack something when you go through 1 Samuel. If you're looking at David, you're like, okay, but why did he do that? If this is the answer for the people of Israel, why did he make that choice? In chapter 21, you remember that whole scene where he's on the run, starting in verse 10, and he goes to Gath, and he probably thinks that Achish is going to help him out somehow, but he kind of changes his mind, and he's like, okay, I'm in trouble here. So he changed his behavior, verse 13, before them, and pretended to be insane in their hands, and made marks on the doors of the gate, and let his spittle run down in his beard, which is a really shameful thing for him to do. And then Achish said to his servants, behold, you see this man is mad. Why then have you brought him to me? Do I lack madmen that you have brought this fellow to behave as a madman in my presence? Like, I've got plenty of madmen, guys. I don't need another one. That's kind of what he's saying, right? Do I lack madmen? But he's putting on this show. He's being deceptive just to save his own skin. You're like, is this guy the answer for Israel, really? Now, don't get me wrong. He is a man after God's own heart. He is this king that is a lot better than Saul, but he's still not the answer. Even in chapter 27, let's give you a little review here. You can look with me at verse 1. You kind of see the fact that this is going to be trouble, this whole scene. It's 27, then David said in his heart. No, he didn't inquire of the Lord. He said in his heart, now I shall perish one day by the hand of Saul. He's like, this guy's going to kill me. He's after me. He's never going to give up. There's nothing better for me than that I should escape to the land of the Philistines. What? You're going to go to your enemies? Then Saul will despair of seeking me any longer within the borders of Israel, and I shall escape out of his hand. So he doesn't seek the Lord. He doesn't lean on the Lord. He says in his own heart, this is what I'm going to do. I'm going to go to our enemies. And he ends up being with his men there, and he goes out on raids for the king of Philistia. But he's lying to the king of Philistia, saying that he's doing this he's actually making raids on other places. He's lying, and then he actually ends up going to these places doing raids, and he's killing people murderously. He's wiping everybody out when he does these raids, and then he puts himself in this impossible situation where I think it's Achish, the king, he wants him to actually fight with him against the people of Israel, like his own people. And it's kind of a bind, but then God saves him from that conundrum, that tight spot of actually being put against his own people. God makes it so that Achish's council disagrees with allowing him to be a part of it, and he doesn't actually have to fight against the people of Israel, his own kin, so to speak. So you've got these really disobedient acts of unbelief on the part of David too. He's a fallen hero. So he can't be the answer either. But there's a future. There's a future hope, isn't there? There's a future hope. And we'll talk more about this next time. But 2 Samuel chapter 7. We referred to this with the book of Ruth. 2 Samuel 7, the Davidic covenant. Referring in an immediate sense to Solomon, who was going to come after David. But then we're told that there's going to be a son of David who's going to sit on his throne forever. And so when you get to chapter 1 of Luke, and the angel is talking, Gabriel, he's talking to Mary, speaking of her son that's in her womb, right, or she will conceive and give birth to, but who's he going to be? Who's his son that you're going to give birth to? Verse 32, he will be great and will be called the Son of the Most High. And the Lord God will give to him the throne of his father David, and he will reign over the house of Jacob forever. In his kingdom, there will be no end. There's a future hope. David's not it, ultimately. No king that we see in the Old Testament, in the monarchy, right? No king is it. But there is one who will sit on that throne, the throne of David, who will be it. The serpent crusher, right? The one who will crush the head of Satan, that will deliver his people from their sins, who will make all things new, as he says in Revelation 21. And we actually see this warrior king, Jesus, coming back one day. We know that the first time he came, right? The prophecies were true. The Davidic covenant, true. Jesus arrives. He comes as this human. He takes on humanity as the God-man, and he's able to die in our place and rise again, just what we need for our forgiveness and our redemption. Just as sure as his first coming is his second coming. Do you believe that? Just as sure. And so, we look at this in Revelation 19, verse 11. And I saw heaven opened, and behold, a white horse. The one sitting on it is called Faithful and True, and in righteousness he judges and makes war. His eyes are like a flame of fire, and on his head are many diadems, and he has a name written that no one knows but himself. He is clothed in a robe dipped in blood, and the name by which he is called is the Word of God. John chapter 1, anybody? And the armies of heaven, arrayed in fine linen, white and pure, were following him on white horses. From his mouth comes a sharp sword with which to strike down the nations, and he will rule them with a rod of iron. He will tread the winepress of the fury of the wrath of God the Almighty. On his robe and on his thigh he has a name written. What is it? King of Kings and Lord of Lords. This is the King. As sure as his first coming is his second coming, when he will come to rule and to reign. And we need to ask, is this king my king? Is he my king? Have I bowed the knee to this king? Because David's not it. Saul certainly wasn't it. But the one who would come in the line of David, he's it. Forevermore, he is King of Kings and Lord of Lords. Let's pray. Gracious God,